So I'm making 3 bowls that are going to be like patterns, just different amounts of segments. One's going to be a 24 ring open segment, one's going to be a 24 ring closed segment, and this one's going to be a 16 ring closed segment. So let's see how I made this particular bowl right here, the first one. Okay guys, I've got a treat for you in the next 3 videos here. It's December and I'm making some bowls for Christmas presents. So I got a little busy today on the table saw. I actually cut out 3 different bowls and they're all actually going to use the same pattern that I have here. And all going to be about the same size. So it's going to be interesting to see how that works out. But the first one I'm going to start working on is a 16 segment, which is all closed. And it goes 8 rows high. And again, it's going to have, this particular one is going to have maple and walnut going up to create this pattern down here on the bottom. And the next 2 are going to be 24 segments. And that one there is a 24 segment closed segment. And again, it's going to be the exact same specifications as this one. The only difference is there's 24 segments. And instead of walnut, I'm going to have wingay. So it's going to be maple and wingay. And then this one here is a 24 segment, or a 24 open segment bowl that's going to have maple and walnut. And again, it's going to follow the same, all of them are going to follow the same color patterns on the outside and be the same size bowl. So it'll be interesting to see what all 3 of them look like when I get done. So in this video, I'm going to start with showing you how I put together the 16 segment, a closed segment one. Now, I didn't show you, I'm not going to show you, the table saw work because you've seen that before in my other videos. I'm just going to show you gluing up, getting it all set, getting it on the lathe, and burning through it. All right, so let's check it all out. So starting with my bottom ring, I'm going to go ahead and glue up all of these segments. Now, for this particular one, I'm using the tape method, which is I just lay out a piece of tape with the sticky side up and then put all the edges of the outside pieces of the segments down on the tape and then add glue in between. Once the glue is all done, then I just roll it on up and hold it together with rubber bands after that. Now, my smaller rings, I don't do that because I don't need the tape with the small. I can get the rubber band around the smaller rings. But this larger rings, I find that if I use the tape first, get it around, and that's much easier to stretch those larger rubber bands around them. For the lower rings, the smaller rings after the base one, I made this stick up to keep them all in line so I could easily place glue across all of them, because that sort of seems to be the key point when gluing up segmented pieces to get this glue around there. Now, the glue is important on the end grain because it does soak in pretty fast, so you want a good amount of glue there, but that doesn't really give it the strength. The strength actually comes once you place all the rings on top of each other. But on the smaller rings, I just go ahead and place the glue on the edges, then put them all together, and then just wrap the rubber band around them, and it's pretty easy to work that way. After a certain size, my hands aren't big enough to hold the ring all down, and I have to go back to a different method. Alright, so once I get to rings that are too big for my hand to span across, I have to use another method for gluing them up if I want to continue using the rubber bands. So I watched one guy do the tape method, which is what I'm doing here. It's basically laying down a strip of tape, and in this case I used blue tape, and then taking all the segment pieces and putting them in their proper order on top of that tape, with the outside touching down onto the tape and sticking to that. Then I add glue in between the pieces, and then once the glue is all in there and on all the edges, I go ahead and just roll up the tape and tape it together, place it down on my mat, and then I can easily put across my larger rubber bands, which are kind of tough to do if everything isn't held in place with the tape. So this seems to work out really well for me. I like this method a lot, and probably one that I'm going to continue to use until I get rings that are just too big for any of the larger rubber bands that I've purchased. Once each ring is glued up and the rubber bands are around it, I go ahead and place them in between a couple of pieces of wax paper and some plywood with weight on top. That way it makes sure that the ring glues up flat. On the very bottom ring, I like to put a design. So what I've done is my bottom segments are cut so that they don't come completely closed in the center. I have about an inch to an inch and a half, 2-inch opening in the bottom, and with a little bit of design because I cut the segments at a little bit of an angle. And with that, I use epoxy resin to fill that in with a color. And in this case, I'm going to be using a white pearl to go, to contrast with the dark walnut at the bottom. Now to pour this in there, I use blue tape on the bottom of the piece and seal that up, and then I wrap the entire piece up in shrink plastic that you use for wrapping pallets or wrapping up packages, and then I just cut an opening in the very top where I can pour in my epoxy resin, which you see here. And then I'll take all the rings over to my drum sander and sand them down smooth. I make a mark around all the rings with chalk and then just sand it until that chalk is all gone and all the pieces are smooth on one side. Then I flip them over and sand them. Now some pieces will get done before others because they just lined up a little bit better. And once I get them down to the smooth on both sides, I just pull them out. I don't worry about them all being exactly the same height because there might be a 1/16 of an inch difference between the last one I pulled out and the first one, and nobody's going to notice that once you get it all glued up, so I don't worry about that too much. Now the way I glue up my rings is I place a ring on top of the other one, and I work from the largest to the smallest, and I measure and get them lined up square, and once I have them squared on all four sides, then I'm going to draw a line all the way around it so I know where the ring goes back in place. And to make sure that I put it exactly in place, I'm going to draw 2 lines, one on each side, that match up with the ring, the upper ring and the one that I'm attaching, the bottom ring and the one that I'm attaching. And that'll keep it lined up exactly the way that I have it placed when I first put it on there. Now once I have all those lines on there, I'm going to glue 4 pieces of small wood, in this case I'm using balsa wood, all around the ring. And what this is going to do is when I place the glue on there and I put weights on top, it's going to prevent that ring from sliding around and moving, which is a big problem when you're gluing up the rings. Some people use salt and other methods, but I find that this works pretty good for me, and it lines up everything quite well. And you can use anything you want to glue the piece of wood on because you're going to turn them off later on anyway. In this case, I'm using CA glue because it works very fast. You can use I've used hot glue before. Just basically anything you want. So that's how I line up all my rings and glue them up. So now that I have all of my rings marked out and with the blocks glued in place so that they line up correctly, I just reverse the stack over, and I start with the largest ring on the bottom, and then I generally will work like half the bowl at a time. So in this case I have 8 rings. I'll do 4 rings, put a piece of plywood on top, let that dry, and then afterwards I will do the other 4 rings, and that'll get me to my bottom piece, and I'll place weight on top of that. But I find this method works really well. It seems to line them up all pretty good. It keeps my pattern, gives me a chance to double check my pattern as I'm gluing it up, and that's always a good thing because you don't want to mess up your pattern and find out after the fact that you've messed up your pattern. So this sort of gives me a nice double check while I'm gluing up everything. When it finally comes time to turning the bowl, I generally like to start on the outside to get my bowl round and try to prevent as much wobble as I can, so that way it turns true and it's a little bit easier to work on the inside. I start out with a bowl gouge, working on each ring, trimming that to shape first. And generally, if I've glued up my bowl right, it's pretty close to the shape that I want, so it makes it easy to follow the design pattern of the bowl. On the inside of the bowl, I like to use the Easy Wood Tools finisher, the carbide finisher. This tool has a nice extended reach, which makes it easy to get to the very bottom. And then when I actually do work on the bottom, I will change out the carbide tip to a negative rate scraper carbide tip. But in this case, I'm just using the flat carbide tip, cutting the wood, getting it all to shape on the inside, following the pattern that's laid out for my rings. The tool actually does make quick work of getting that done, and that's the other reason I like using it. And the cuts tend to be pretty clean, but you do sort of get grooves if you work too fast. Because the finisher is a round carbide tip, it's easy to get grooves into the wood. So on the final cut, you want to make it nice and smooth and just a continuous cut, slow cut, so that you don't get sort of a corkscrew effect with it. And once you do that, it actually gives a pretty nice finish that is good for maybe a negative rake scraper at the very end. But from this point, generally I just go right to sanding after I'm done using the carbide tip. So for the very bottom, I put my negative rake scraper carbide tip onto the Easy Wood Tools finisher. And this really works well, especially when you hit the resin. It gives a nice smooth cut on the resin. It doesn't chip it out like the regular carbide tip does. It's a little slower on the wood. You don't take as aggressive a cut, but that's okay with me. I don't mind going, making extra passes just to get a nice smooth cut, especially going across the resin there. Well, I spared you all the boring sanding, but I basically sanded this down. Um, on this particular one, I went down to 600 grit, and it took a little while, but it was okay. And then I cleaned up everything with denatured alcohol at first. The Mylan sanding sealer I'm going to use on it first and place that down. And then once that is all over there, I will just basically wipe it down. And then I'm going to use the Axe abrasive paste. I'm going to place that on there and go ahead and do the whole procedure with that, and then follow that up with the Axe polishing paste. And that's going to make the whole inside of this bowl and outside food safe. Now it's time to work on the bottom. I flipped the bowl around, used the coal jaws to hold onto the front with some padding around them so it doesn't mar the surface. That's all finished now. And I cut off the tenon with a saw, just my pull saw, and got rid of that first, and didn't spared you that fun stuff. And then after that, I'm just going to clean up everything off the bottom, and I'm actually going to work the bottom so that I have an edge around there, and then the inside will go in a little bit and a little deeper. So that way when it sits down, it sits around the edge and not the entire bottom, so you don't need a complete flat surface. And I find that if I do that, the bowl sits a little better when it's resting on the outside rim of the bottom rung, or the bottom ring, I should say. When it's sitting on the bottom ring. The bottom of the bowl gets the same finishing procedure as the rest of the bowl, starting out with a couple coats of sanding sealer, the Mylan sanding sealer, and then I'm going to use the Axe sanding paste, or abrasive paste, and then the Axe polishing paste on the bottom. And once that's all done, the bowl is finished. All right, so I'm really happy as to how this bowl came out. This looks really, really good. The 16 segment bowl, all my patterns are going to follow the same. They're going to start with a dark bottom. Then I'm going to have 2 pieces of the dark wood, which in this case is walnut. And then I'm going to have maple in between them. Now this one has 2 pieces of walnut, then 2 pieces of maple, and 2 pieces of walnut because it's 16 segments across. And I want to have 4 of these spirals going on up. Now the pattern is going to follow the same on all of them. It's going to be 2 walnut, and then the next walnut's going to start in the middle of the second one, and then go on over for 2, then start in the middle of the second one, and so on and so forth up to the top. Now this particular one is going to a friend of mine, and he's giving it to his mom for a present. So unfortunately, I won't have this to compare with the other 2 that I'm going to be doing, but I will have the other 2 to compare side by side. So again, this is the 16 segment bowl, closed segment bowl. In the bottom here, I used resin to fill in this part here, and these are basically 16 segments coming together at an angle to create that pattern in there. And that's the way I do most of the bottoms of my bowls now. I like the way that comes out. So I'm really happy with the way this looks. I think it's a great looking bowl, and I'm hoping he'll be real happy. If he's not real happy with it, I'm bringing it back home because I'm real happy with it. So 1 down, 2 more to go.